Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to our authors talk for the fall, where we're exploring a number of topics that we have been understudied in the history of, well, skyscrapers and architecture generally. So focusing tonight on the American construction industry, a historical view, but a view that has a long precedent, which is explored in this book by Brian Bowen on the American construction industry, but prefaced with starting with the pyramids, taking us through the ancient world, through the Gothic and into the Renaissance, onto the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of American construction and the pride of the American construction industry, construction management when it comes to skyscraper history. So tonight in this book, which is not terribly thick, but which condenses an enormous amount of material, Brian Bowen brings together the knowledge of his practice in the construction industry and a long career that began in England, expanded to Canada and in the United States, where he worked in construction management. And after retiring as the president of Hanscomb Inc, he went on to develop a course on construction history at Georgia Institute of Technology. And this book comes out of that professor of practice role, and also in the organization of materials, which has not been that accessible in a single volume. In 2008, in addition, Brian helped to establish the Construction History Society of America, which was a kind of expansion of what had already been an organization of scholars and of people with specialized interest in the history of construction that started in the UK. And this organization, some of the members of which I hope are listening tonight, it really delves into many areas across all ages of building construction. But we asked Brian tonight, because he's at the Skyscraper Museum, to focus a little bit on the late 19th going into the 20th century. And after he lays out this organization of the book with a little bit of focus on the modern period, he's going to be joined in dialogue by our close friend and colleague, Donald Friedman, who is a great expert on historical building construction. In fact, he's written 2 editions of a book by that title, as well as Structure and Skyscrapers. And Don knows as much, I think, as anybody, certainly in New York, knows about the history of building. And so I think this conversation among peers and experts will lend a lot to helping us who are not specialists understand the organization of the industry, the questions that arise, and how much we still don't know about construction history. So by way of introducing in another voice of another colleague of the Skyscraper Museum, a kind of testimonial to Brian's book, I'll quote from Thomas Leslie's blurb on the back cover, and says this book is a much needed corrective to architectural history, placing contractors and builders at the center of a long story of building construction, essential as a reference and enlightening as a narrative. So with that, I will leave the screen and invite Brian to come on and share his screen. And then after Brian's talk of about 25 minutes or so, he'll be joined by Don Friedman. And I will monitor any questions that come into the chat box and try to introduce those at the end of their conversation into questions for a more general audience. So Brian, please take over. It's all yours.
Thank you, Cara, for the background. And it saves me going into a rather boring talk of what my career has been. In 2000, I retired from the company after about 40 years with it, and at the time, I had been on an advisory committee to the College of Architecture at Georgia Tech, dealing with continuing education, mostly for architects and for the construction managers. And when I retired, I went to the dean and said, listen, I'd like to give something back to an industry which has been good to me. And he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, no, you tell me what you want to do. And he said, it doesn't work that way in academia. You tell us what you want to do. And I said, well, I thought that really I'd looked over the curriculum and seen that there was very little other than in architectural history on the background of the industry we have today. And so I told him that. He said, fine, go ahead. So I spent about a year and a half reading and reading and reading a lot of material on individual parts and individual times of history dealing with design and construction, and eventually put a course together. This is the cover of the course I developed, History of the Construction Industry. I taught it for about 10 or 12 years to the architects, construction managers, and the civil engineers. And it was well received, and as noted during that time, the Construction History Society of America was formed. And so at the end of it all, through another colleague, he said, you know, this is really good stuff. You should put in a book proposal, which I did to Routledge, and they accepted it. And then it came at a wonderful time with the pandemic, where I virtually spent a whole year working on the book. And some of the background to that was Carol already touched on it. This is an interesting quote from Richard Goldthwaite, who is an economic historian, wrote a wonderful book on the building of Renaissance Florence. He says there are histories of style, of building types, of construction techniques and building materials, but for the most part, we are without studies of construction as a problem in industrial organization. And that I've borne in mind as I began to continue developing the course. So here's the cover of the book. There are 14 chapters. It begins with an overview of the industry at large, then proceeds on a chronological basis to deal with classical times, very in summary form, largely because in the Dark Ages, most of the skills of the Greeks and Romans were lost. Some of them came back later, of course, and continuing all the way through to the current times. And then there are two chapters at the end of conclusions and my own sort of summary of it all as to what I think the future holds for the industry at large. Most of the early chapters follow this kind of what I call an analytical framework, which begins with why the projects were built, how they were financed, who did the design and construction, and so on. Just quickly run your eye down. All those subjects there that give a very rounded view of a building and construction, ending with regulations and so on. That is supplemented in each of the chapters, usually by what I've called sidebars that are much more detailed on specific subjects. Here's just a selection from I think about the 30 or so sidebars that are included in the book. Most of them are just 1 or 2 pages at the most. The Hornby Church contract from 1409 and the medieval contract. Brunelleschi's Dome, we all know about that. The Iron Bridge at Colebrookdale. The Erie Canal, 5 general contractors in the late 18th century. And of course, it wouldn't be complete without the Empire State Building. There's also a list of further books for further reading, and it's very well illustrated. I managed to raise some money to persuade the publishers to include color, and so there are over 100 illustrations in the book. Here are some of them, just an odd selection of them from different periods. The Parthenon, Notre Dame, the first building price book, a timber mill, Lee's house in Stratford Hall, designed and built by an undertaker, a very early version of a general contractor. Then at the bottom on the left, the Erie Canal had some very interesting innovations associated with it. And of course, the famous tower here, the name's is Home Insurance, isn't it? I think, building in Chicago, supposedly one of the first real skyscrapers. The one on the right at the bottom, I think, is particularly interesting because it's from I'm losing the name of the suburb in Long Island that was built in the 1940s, and they prefabbed everything. And here you see this wonderful photograph of the slab with all the bits and pieces of the building. There are 8 people there. They put that house together in a day or a day and a half, and it's just quite extraordinary. Levittown is the name of it, Levittown. Okay, we obviously can't go through the 1,000 years or more of history, but I just selected 3 big events in construction history that really created the framework and structure that we have today. The first being the medieval period. That's the period where the overall framework of the industry we have today can go back in a straight line. This is in this period, 1100, running for about 500 years, and started due to the extraordinary growth in Christianity in Western Europe and the building of buildings like this one here, these enormous cathedrals. They're completely out of scale to any other types of construction that were going on, with the exception of some of the big castles, I guess, for defensive reasons. And this, I love this graphic. It's by Philippe Fix, who's a French graphic artist. And you can look at it I can look at it now and see things I've never seen before and think, good Lord, that's how they did it. Did it very cleverly. Then the second of the third events, it comes as the Industrial Revolution. This begins in Great Britain, has its seeds in the 1600s, the Enlightenment, scientific explorations, and so on, and it goes in very quickly into the 18th century, with the beginning of that century, the invention of the Newcomen steam engine that's eventually perfected by James Watt in the mid of that century, and forms one of the key components in creating the Industrial Revolution, which continued there. This led to an enormous amount of construction, canals and other infrastructure to move materials and people around, the factories, the railways, military and naval construction. On the right there is a picture of the iron bridge at Coalbrookdale, built in 1791, the first time iron was used in this form of construction. Even the American President Jefferson had a picture of this in his estate. He was so impressed with it. But it also led, interestingly enough, towards the end of this period, around the early 1800s, to the emergence of the general contractor. Prior to this time, we'd seen construction being handled trade by trade with some sort of rather loose oversight, not of architects, because they didn't really exist until the 18th century in form that we recognize them. And the British government was pretty well constantly at war during the 18th century. And of course, the Napoleonic Wars had broken out, vast expansion of their military, requiring a lot of barracks. And they were fed up with the time it took trade by trade, the disputes that arose, and they didn't have anybody who could handle it. And so they put out a bid for a general contractor. And this man, Thomas Cubitt, was one of them that obtained one of the contracts. and his company existed all the way through until about 1980 or thereabouts. So the Industrial Revolution moves over to America in the latter part of the 19th. As soon as the Civil War is resolved, and the Civil War itself, of course, builds the industrial strength, particularly of the northern states. And after that, there is an incredible boom that occurs. Civil War is concluded. There are waves of immigration coming in. The West is opening up. The industrial expansion is unbelievably strong. So it puts a big strain on the way construction is handled and done at that time. It's just one little example to give you the flavor of what was going on at this incredible time. And the upper portion is the railways in 1860 in the country. And just below it, 30 years later in 1890, look at the expansion that has taken place, all of which required extraordinary efforts in construction. And that's just only one part of the infrastructure development that was going on. Well, one of the features, of course, was the development of high-rise building. What most people don't realize is that right up until this time, from the earliest of times, about the maximum height that was feasible for any type of building, whether it was residential or for others, mills and so on, was about 5 stories. Once you got higher than that, you had some problems. There is some evidence that the Romans built up their tenements up to 8 stories, but there's no real confirmation of that. And if they did, there were a lot of collapses. But here is New York in 1876. Look at that skyline. Oh yeah, there's a few church spires, Trinity Church over there. 2 or 3 very large buildings. One of them, I'm not sure exactly which one it is. One of these 2 here is the Western Union Telegraph Building that reached to 10 stories. And the thickness of the bearing walls was extraordinary for that time. But Western Union, of course, was a very, very successful company that had basically consolidated all the telegraph through pretty well the whole of the country. And now we're now in the midst. This is 1876. Things are going ahead at an extraordinary pace. And by 2008, just 32 years later, here's a view of New York, thanks to the photographs from the Skyscraper Museum itself, which continue to track this development of particularly Manhattan Island and surrounding New York. 32 years later, that's almost less than a generation. Well, and it is at this time that the phrase "a skyscraper" comes to be used. At the back there is the Singer building, which rose about 37 or 40 stories, I think. It was the tallest building in New York, and the word skyscraper begins to enter into the vocabulary. It is thought that it comes from the naval terms in which the highest sail of the mizzenmast was called the sky sail and became corrupted into skyscraper. So how was this reaching for the sky possible to suddenly, in such a short period of time, go from 5 stories up to 30, 40, and then eventually higher? Well, we have the main products, especially the iron and steel, its production, its improvements, and the structural engineering that went with it enabled us to get away from the bearing wall problem. And the other major component was the safety elevator, invented by Otis, and also glass and other material production is being mechanized. building service engineering to keep buildings warm, not cool at that time, but warm, and ventilated was taking major steps in developing their skills. The construction equipment necessary to go to such heights was now being powered by steam. And the new forms of labor are developing, especially the iron workers, for example. And this begins to lay all kinds of problems for the future as the new trades begin to squabble with the old ones, and that doesn't do the labor movement a lot of good. The supply chains then chains are put in place with the infrastructure improvements that are taking place. And what then begins to happen, as it did in England in the early 1800s, is the rise of general contracting and new methods of contracting. And that's a long story that's been very well covered by the AGC's Centennial book, which is listed as a reference in my book. And then we begin to see architecture and engineering emerging as a business instead of a rather sort of flighty occupation. And that helps as well. Well, here's just some illustrations. There's Otis up on the top left, demonstrating his safety elevator, I believe, at the New York World Exhibition in 1854. And this is a sensation, because we'd had elevators for years before, but not ones that were safe to travel for human beings. And then, of course, the whole basic of metal framework was absolutely essential to enable this to happen. The third one down is an advertisement from one of the new general contractors, George Fuller. We have an interesting sidebar on that company. Fuller was very innovative. He started life being trained as an architect, moves into masonry, and almost by accident becomes a general contractor in Chicago. And along the way, he invents a new form of contracting, very popular these days, of starting construction before the design is complete and doing the work on a cost-plus basis. And his famous contract was then beginning to be copied by others for generations thereafter. And so this all helped to make it. But of course, things didn't stop there. Towards the end of that period of the 19th century, reinforced concrete comes into its own. And concrete had been around for some time, but the idea of reinforcing it with metal bars slowly takes shape and begins to create new labor and new contractors to carry out this work. One of the major ones in that field is Turner Construction, formed in 1902. Turner had worked with, I think it's Arthur Ransome, is it? Or anyway, Ransome, who was a major creative engineer. He was a better engineer, creative engineer than he was businessman, and he went out of business, and Turner picked up his patents. And these were amongst his first jobs, is the subway staircases going down into the subway, hated by the iron and steel people, as you can imagine. And then, of course, there's this continued economic expansion. In 1906 or thereabouts, the United States now supplants the British as the largest industrial country in the world. And of course, the war breaks out in 17, or rather in 14, and America joins in 17. Again, a huge construction demand and boom. The picture on the right here is again the Turner construction project of the headquarters of the US Navy, built in DC in Anacostia, I think, single story, 2 million square feet, built in a handful of months, all in reinforced concrete. and unfortunately no longer exists, but what an achievement that was. Well, the post-war comes around, and there's a boom that continues, a big boom that continues through the 20s, and then eventually, of course, comes to an end in 1930 or thereabouts, 29. This is one of the museum's skylines from 1932, and you see what a change has taken place there, including the Empire State Building at the back there, completed in 31, and took 10 years before it was fully leased because, of course, of the depression that occurs starting in 29, and eventually World War II comes along and saves our bacon. That is our construction bacon. And for example, during that depression, Turner Construction had 400 people on staff at the beginning. By the end of the 1930s, there were only 40 of them left. We think 2008 was a bad depression, but believe you me, that one was unthinkable to have that ever got repeated. So World War II is a salvation for elements of the construction industry, not much for housing, not much for architects, of course, but leads to the formation of new forms of engineering and architectural companies and so on. And again, even though there was a lot of thought in the late, or rather 1944, 45, that maybe the depression would return, there was another post-war boom that then took place through the 1920s. Here's a picture. Of course, this is the picture from the cover of the book, which I should explain. It again shows the incredible versatility of the construction industry. And it is the building, a photograph showing the building of the Alcan Highway, the Alaska-Canada highway that went from Montana all the way up to Alaska, bypassing the sea access, cut through the most unbelievably threatening landscape you could expect. And here's the Corps of Engineers doing work on that. I love that. And there are lots of more pictures of that particular challenging project. So after World War II, there's another post-war boom. As we know, we see a huge boom in the infrastructure, the interstate system, boom in housing. Here's Levittown, which we touched on a little earlier there, and copies of Levittown all over the country, and then a huge industrial expansion. This is the General Motors plant in Lordstown, recently shut down, built in the 60s, producing, I think, the Chevrolet Impala. I had my heart set on buying one of those, and the wife said, "Oh, no, we don't. We had a couple of young kids at that time. You're going to have a station wagon." We ended up with a pretty lousy Ford station wagon for a few years. And there we are. So this leads to the third big boom, or big event in construction history, is the 1960s begin to start a major industry change, which is still underway 50, 60 years later. During the, immediately after the war, the construction unions begin to run amok. They're seeking huge increases in pay, plus 18% in some years, and even worse, working rules that just halt any productivity changes, and prices obviously begin to escalate because the contractors simply take this and pass it along to the owners, and the owners in the late 1960s begin to revolt and say, we won't take it anymore. And in 1969, CUER is formed, the Construction Users Anti-Inflation Roundtable. That's now operating as CURT. In 83, the Construction Industry Institute opens at the University of Texas, a combination of large-scale industrial owners and contractors that has done a lot of very innovative research work. And then more recently, in '94, the Construction Owners of America, Association of America, was formed for those involved in regular building, if you wish. So the owners are standing up and saying, we won't take it anymore. We want you to do things. We want you to understand us, and we want to understand you. And that is a process that is still underway. Of course, the big thing that happens in 1960 is the computing devices arrive on the scene, and we're all, most of us, I think, pretty well aware of the progress of first the computing engineers begin to tackle individual components of the industry, like payroll and scheduling and estimating and so on. And then the next move more recently has been towards stitching these together into comprehensive construction and project management applications. And that is still underway and will have an effect on the industry of the future without any question. There are, at the same time, there are now multiple experiments with project delivery. The owners blame the contractors, who are really only the messengers of the pricing and the delays and the disputes. But nonetheless, this led to a lot of some of the quite innovative experiments in project delivery. Starts with construction management, getting rid of the general contractor effectively. Didn't last very long. Expansion of design build and integrated project delivery and so on. All kinds of very interesting innovations, and we're still at it. All of them, interestingly enough, involve the actual involvement of the contractor earlier and earlier in the process of planning and design. And then the industry has been pretty good, but partly because it doesn't do any research of any value, but borrows ideas from other industries, which isn't a bad way of doing things, actually. So the lean construction that has seen a lot of applications in recent years came out of Toyota, supposedly. CPM, the scheduling systems had been developed by IBM. Value engineering had been developed by General Electric. The new forms of printing now coming into use and so on. So this is all to the good. So there we are. Those are the three main big events that have been affecting the way the industry has been structured. And the end of the book, the last two chapters, opens with around 40 or so trends that are actually underway. These I've taken from reading, from conferences, from magazines, from friends and allies and so on. And some of them are going to be fads, I suspect, but others will have a bearing on what the future holds. And I've had a stab of that in the last chapter already. Some of that text is out of date because it was written about a year ago, but nonetheless, some of it is still quite relevant. The future demographics are uncertain. Obviously, we won't build unless there are people willing to pay for what we build and have demands and needs for what we will be doing. There is one body of opinion that says that from the 7.5 billion people on Earth, it'll grow to 9 billion by 2050. Others say it won't. It, in fact, will reduce. We don't know. Then these are just some of the subjects that are included in that chapter, the consolidations and combinations that we've witnessed. Companies, the one that most stands out, like perhaps a sore thumb to some people, AECOM, who seems to have just bought up and developed into a huge entity. Its billings are now over $20 billion a year. But even at that, that's only 2%, less than 2% of the total value of construction put in place during a year. Segmentation, that is specialization, where now, for example, if you want to build a sports arena, there are probably 5 building contractors that you would go to, and probably less than that in terms of architects and engineers who've been specialized in these things, data centers and things of that kind. New project relationships taking place. I mentioned the fact that the contracting expertise is being introduced earlier and earlier into construction, and that creates contracting problems and relationship problems and trust-related issues that are still working themselves out. Industrialization, prefabrication is of course a big buzzword. We'll see where that is heading, and there have been some successes and some failures in that field. So that's a work in progress. New professions coming along, especially in the field of project and program management, cost management, and so on. These new ways of buying, designing construction services. Life cycle support has always bothered me that we would work on a project, we would work our backs off to get it finished and completed, and when it was done, we walked away. Well, many owners were left in the lurch with that, and I think that's going to change in the future. There's going to be some opportunities there that people can see. And then, of course, the changes that will be accommodating technology, and technology accommodating the way we do the work is definitely a work in progress. So look at this, isn't this incredible? I love this. I'm not sure whether I love the photograph, but it is a meaningful one to show what's happened in just in New York with the proliferation of these extraordinary tall buildings. We can now build as high as we want to go. There are obviously some limits which have nothing to do with design and construction expertise. Frank Lloyd Wright's kilometer-high building, which was a point of reference for some time, is definitely a possibility. Is it economically viable? Well, that's yet to be seen. So we'll see where all that heads. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. To me, construction history matters. And I do hope you will check out the Construction History Society of America. There's a very interesting group of people that run from academics to participants in the industry itself that work together, and they're great. You can reach me at any of those 2 emails there. So thank you. I hope we all, I like the comment that one effective speaker, the name will come to me in a minute, said that he was giving a speech and he said, well, I came here to talk and you came here to listen. I hope we finished at the same time. So over to you, Don, and to Carol. So thank you.
My first question, I think, requires just a little bit of background. When I was reading your book, what jumped out at me is that it is, it's in the spirit of the Construction History Society. In talking about construction, you're talking about the history of technology. And technology in sort of a broad sense, starting with the muscle power and hemp ropes 1,000 years ago. And I'm just, Tom Leslie's quote that Carol read sort of gets at that this is not architectural history per se. It's parallel, but it's not the same thing. And I was just curious as to how you saw the interaction between what you're interested in, what you've been talking about, what you've been doing for a very long time, and the history of architecture, which is the way most people come at this topic.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting subject that could do with a lot more examination, especially of its historical background. I mentioned, that our industry or components of it do very little in the way of research and development, and tend to steal ideas, borrow ideas, are very, very careful about adopting new ideas. you would know this, the adoption of being willing to use steel instead of iron took a little bit of time for the industry to come to accepting that. And I mean, the interesting thing, steam power wasn't really applied all that much to construction until the mid 80s, like 100 years after Watt's the development of the improved steam engine. So it is a very conservative industry from that respect. And as I said, also just recently, borrows a lot of ideas from somewhere else. And I think we need, more money being committed to doing research in the technical area. And then that's one thing, but getting it adopted is another, because of this conservatism. People are not willing to stick their heads out and try something new. I mean, these interesting techniques of squirting a building out of a hose with new forms of concrete and so on are just interesting.
Well, let me just ask a question about that, because, and I mentioned this when we talked last, Thomas Edison tried to patent and tried to create an industry for prefab concrete houses, something on the order of 110 years ago, and failed miserably. It was one of his few just absolute failures. Nobody was, it went nowhere. He lost all the money he put in. And they're not, what he was trying to do was not that different from what you just mentioned, which is using a 3D printer and concrete to build a house. So is the only difference the technology? Are we more ready for something like that now than people were in 1910? Why do you think that we're revisiting this very old idea?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The one other thing that I think we probably are in a better field now, and one of the reasons being that us, well, I'm not even a boomer myself, but the boomers are slowly retiring and leaving the industry, and what's coming in are Generation X and Y and Z and so on. And these guys and the boomers had some difficulties in accepting the technical changes that were taking place, whereas the youngsters come in and they have these skills already baked in from the age of 2 or 3. So they're much more receptive to new ideas, I think. Plus the diversity in the industry, I think, is going to help that. But, as I mentioned, I think we need some commitment of some funding and some money for this that might help, but, well, we'll see.
Okay. So along the lines of, I think what you've mentioned now twice, doing more research, and I agree with you that, looking at the 30, 35 years I've been in practice, and things have changed, but very slowly compared to other fields in the last 30 or 35 years. So is your book trying to convince people, look at the history of construction and see how things have changed and try to extrapolate that to the future? I mean, are you making a push in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's several things I could say about why construction history does matter. It obviously matters from this point of we try things, they fail, so we don't repeat them. Oh, well, of course we do repeat them. Look at the collapse in Miami, and but that's another matter. I think one of the things that I feel about construction history is that the industry itself is not well regarded in the press, in academia, in government. You remember Reagan had that saying that the worst phrase in the American language is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." Well, what the worst phrase for us in construction is, "Oh, how are you doing, Charlie? I have the builders in." And as if this is, so we're not very well regarded, and this is affecting our recruitment. And I think we've got to have a lot more pride in what the industry has achieved. And we've done some incredible things over the centuries, and features that we have done and problems that we've overcome. You just have to look at when we're really pressed, like those 2 world wars. I mean, that building I showed you that Turner built was built in just, I think, about 6 months. And so we can do it. But of course, money eventually begins to come into it. So I think instilling some sort of sense of pride, this is what I tried to do with my students, was to say, listen, you're coming into something that offers an opportunity to really do something worthwhile, and the process of improve how it's done. So,
and one last question I want to ask, I guess, before we throw it open to everybody. Something that you sort of touched on briefly in your talk, but is very clear in the book, is the issue of fragmentation. That, if you're looking at automobile production or computer production, there are a handful of large firms that sort of drive the industry, and you can see where things are going by looking at them. But that with construction, there are many, many small firms. And even the biggest firm, as you said in your talk, isn't that big relative to the industry itself.
right.
And as far as I can tell from, I don't know myself, from reading your book, as far as I can tell, that's pretty much always been true in the American industry. So do you see that changing? Do you think that the new technology you touched on earlier will help consolidation, or maybe make it so that the fragmentation doesn't matter?
Right. No, that's a very good question, and for which I don't really have an answer. History would tell us that it really just won't happen. But I mean, and it is. There are according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are 850,000 entities operating under their heading of construction. 850,000, of which something like 60% have less than 4 employees. And it's an easy industry to get into. I mean, if you want to get into construction, that's in design or in any kind of building, you need a beat-up F-150 truck. You need a relative who can keep your books straight. You don't need to invest a lot of money. And it's the same with on design end of things, and you're in business. The corollary of that, of course, is that it's also a very easy business to be ejected from, because the capitalization is just not there to be able to suffer a heavy loss. But I don't know. We'll see what happens with AECOM. They've got so many, they're virtually dealing with figuring virtually everything except possibly large-scale residential construction. And we'll see whether that survives. But as I pointed out, they have 24 million, and even that's only like 2%. And it's the same on the owner side, of course. There isn't an owner that dominates it. And unlike the Europeans, the government involvement in it is very small. The actual federal chunk of the $1.3 billion spent on construction last year, maybe this year, is only like 2% of that. What's interests me, by the way, is the infrastructure bill that just passed is about the same as 1 year of whole construction carried out in this country. So, and I realize that the figure, which I'm not sure whether it's 1.5 billion or 2 billion or whatever it is, but it's a trillion. I'm sorry, it's spread over a number of years, of course, but still. So anyway, we'll see.
Carol, do we have questions?
We have some comments but no pointed questions that are broad enough. So let me just take this opportunity to ask people to contribute questions to the chat, and then I will pose them to Brian or Don. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, as a disembodied voice, let me ask you this question of my own. And as I think all the viewers can see, Don is actually here at the Skyscraper Museum. So we will conclude by putting two heads together in one box and invite you to come down to the museum to see the real space, and hope that we're all back again sometime soon in the physical space for evenings like this, and a glass of wine afterwards. But let me ask Don, who is some of you who don't know him personally, is a practicing structural engineer who runs a company called Old Structures and does a great deal of historic preservation, does a great deal of forensic analysis, and based on, and also nightly in an amazing display of verbal productivity, Don has a blog called Old Structures, where he finds an image and uses that as a springboard for talking about issues of structure or history of New York or building types. So Don, my question is to you, to what extent can you take the building as an artifact for research in order to talk about a construction, history in the construction industry? How are the buildings kind of documents that you can read and conclude certain things about the practice of construction in the 1880s, 19-teens, 1930s, in buildings that you see as examples of different kinds of construction?
I would argue that buildings as artifacts are just the best historical record you're ever going to get in any field. The gold standard in historical research is a primary source. The primary sources for construction would be drawings or specifications, or as Brian discusses in his book, contracts. But the problem with them is that they don't necessarily reflect what actually got built. Whereas the building as an artifact, that is, I mean, there may have been alterations, but that is what was built. And that is more accurate than the primary sources, has been my experience. I've seen buildings where I saw two sets of drawings with the same date that showed different buildings. And, I don't know which one is correct. I have to go look at the actual physical object to tell. So I think that, looking at, there's a whole field of looking at the tool marks on stone and the tool marks on wood to determine the age of a building built before modern construction. And that's using the physical artifacts to inform history of construction topics.
Mm-hmm. Let me now read some questions from the audience from Kevin Gribno. Yes, I guess, Brian, or both of you, any insight on moving from rigid building codes, with many not based on science, going to performance-based design and contracting?
Yeah, well, this has been put about for quite some time. I mean, first off, in America, we had this unusual situation of, because it wasn't in the Constitution, it was all left to the individual states to work out the rules and regulations surrounding building and other factors, I guess. And they, in turn, shoved it down to the counties and to the cities. And as a result, I don't know what the figure was, there was something like 3,000 different building codes spread across the land that have now been brought together, I believe. I've lost track of the exact status of that, into a uniform building code.
More or less.
Or less, okay. So, you know, that's definitely an American problem that we have, but I suppose in some respects it has strength, because you could argue that having codes that address the far west, northwest, compared with Florida, immediately raises climatological issues that have to be dealt with in the codes. So I don't know. You know, the lack of standardization has some strengths, and whether or not we will still go to this one simple overall code, I don't know. Don?
Well, I think the issue of performance-based codes to some degree gets to the issue of contractual organization. If the example of performance-based code that I've been using my whole career is, I don't design steel stairs in a building. I have a specification that throws that on the contractor, and I give some basic information, and then the contractor has to design the stair. And performance, I mean, that's a very simple example, but performance-based codes move a lot more of the building process in that direction. Obviously, the contractor isn't going to figure it all out. It's not their profession, right? The contractor is going to hire their own engineer to design the thing that under a prescriptive code would be designed by the quote designer, unquote. So moving from a prescriptive code to a performance-based code may result in more innovation. I don't know if it will or it won't. It doesn't really eliminate the design. It just switches the design from being prior to construction to during the construction phase. And Brian, I'm sure you could talk about whether or not fast tracking is a good idea.
Well, you know, it's interesting that there is a body of opinion strongly in favor of performance-based codes, particularly when we are moving more and more to the earlier involvement of the contracting community, not just general contractors, but subtrades. And if you're taking a design build contract, you can't suddenly start putting in specifics because the design has not been done. So performance-based clauses there are certainly part of it. I remember once giving a talk to the local AGC chapter here in Atlanta, or Georgia rather, and one of the issues came up was that there were a whole bunch of subcontractors in the audience, and they were complaining about the fact that they are being required to carry out the design to meet the codes from the shop drawings, and that the architects and the engineers were just sidestepping this and saying, you go ahead and do this, and you figure it out, you send it to us and we'll approve it. I know it's an interesting question, and we'll see how it all spins out.
Well, maybe one last question from the chat, and then I'll run downstairs, Don, and join you to wave goodbye to people, and also invite you to our next program next week and preview that in a related or parallel sense of construction. But the last question from the audience is, can you reflect on the history of the introduction of voluntary standards like LEED and lumber grading? What do you see as happening in the near future in terms of standards?
It's not a field I'm very familiar with, I have to say. And it's one has to assume that as we put more and more focus on our reactions to climate change, that we will see, more aspects of this having to be set up by individual units like the LEED, and as with almost all things in life, these are some damn good ideas. You try to put it into effect, and parts of it are good, but it also has unexpected consequences that that arise, and particularly when you're dealing with a sector of the economy that is construction, where the contracting basis is such that lends itself to adversity and to claims and disputes. And there is a very ominous movement that I've noticed here and there on the part of the construction lawyers to insert themselves into contracts permanently, not just to write the contract, but to actually be a consultant during the course of construction. So especially the case with the integrated project delivery systems that require a lot of sorting out for who's responsible for what, how, and so on. I mean, you know, see, no, I mean, the problems again reflect back on the fragmentation of the industry and getting people to agree to something of this kind and to collaborate with it. I mean, I don't know how long it's taken the lead to and even to where it stands today. There was certainly a number of articles I stumbled over during putting this all together that sort of implied that the next big thing for the lawyers were going to be claims against the lead rules and regulations, not so much that, but the implementation of them, and the claims that they would do this and save that, and that the owners would come out complaining about it, and then the lawyers would jump on it. And I'm not sure that there have been any such claims, and one can only hope not.
Any comments, Don?
Oh, one thought about that, Brian, which is a lot of things that are now standard and actually statutory began as voluntary standards. So when the Underwriters Laboratory started talking about fire ratings for buildings, that was up to the individual building if they want to follow the UL recommendations or not. ASTM, American Society of Testing Materials standards, were originally voluntary, and now they're written into the building codes. So a lot of things that begin voluntary, if they're popular and if the industry and if society as a whole sees a value to them, end up no longer being voluntary and becoming required.
Well, it's a great field for some historical research into the way that regulations and controls and so on have developed over the centuries. And so thanks for bringing that up.
So here I am. Yeah, so we're both in the space. And by way of concluding tonight and thanking Brian so much for being with us and sharing all of your knowledge and your research and scholarship, I'll mention one thing that you talk about in the introduction of the book, and there is no answer other than perhaps when we're mentioning how much money is spent in the industry and how many lawyers are involved in it. Using the word, you posed the question, is the construction industry an industry at all? Right, and talking about that fragmentation, and it's certainly something worth pondering. If it's not an industry, what is it? But historically, it seems not to be. If you're studying industrial relations and the kind of dispersion rather than the coalescence and organization in any kind of efficient and functional way. So it's something to think about as we look back over the last decades of construction, though inevitably we're always talking about the present, right? We're always posing our questions from our particular moment. And so I did want to mention the program that we have next Wednesday night on December 1st, when we will be looking back a mere 20 years, but at a topic which is certainly about construction, economics, politics, and all of the issues that come together. The second part of an inquiry on rebuilding the World Trade Center that we initiated around the 9/11 anniversary in September is going to have part 2, where we talk about the commercial imperative for rebuilding, and then look at the adjustments along the way to the larger meaning of that site and the cultural component that we looked at the first time. But we wanted to ask the question about lessons learned in the rebuilding to see if there is a parallel to today, to our present pandemic predicament, and thinking about how does the city recover. But next week we'll have Christopher Ward, who was the head of the Port Authority during the key years of the rebuilding and the 10th anniversary of 9/11. The lawyers involved, Robin Panavka, Bob Lieber, representing the deputy mayor in the city of New York in charge of oversight of the project, as well as Ken Lewis, the managing partner for One World Trade Center at SOM during that rebuilding. So we'll bring together all of the issues and all of the, not all, but some of the stakeholders and the key perspectives on gigantic construction projects like Ground Zero. So I hope we'll have some insights from the key figures in the decision making around a case study that is endlessly interesting, and also I hope offers some parallels for today and how we think about urbanism and construction in the continuously growing and reviving city. So Brian, thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us tonight. And I certainly recommend the book to everyone who wants a handbook that touches on just about every issue that you can imagine in the construction, not industry, but practice from the pyramids to the present. So thanks, Brian. Thanks everybody for joining us. See you, I hope, next Wednesday, and then check our website for the continuing series through the winter and spring. Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.